Enron and financials, Volkswagen and emissions, Lehman Brothers and subprime mortgages, Uber and its tech bro culture, Facebook and harvesting data. What do they all have in common besides a huge drop in shares? Well, it's probably obvious: ethical issues. But what's ethics? What does it mean for day-to-day showing up to work? And is there even a sense of what morals and ethics should be in business? How do you handle theft by employees? How do you get people to work extra hours if you can't pay overtime? How much do you need to tell your supervisor about what went wrong? Do you retain underperforming employees who support families? Do you let them go? If you had a business or accounting ethics course before, we're taking a slightly different approach here to consider ethical communication practices and what ethical leadership communication means. In this chapter and lecture, you'll learn the defining factors of ethical leadership, the bases of power, their costs and benefits and uses. You'll learn to differentiate between ethical, modal, and in values, and be able to explain the 4 components of ethical behavior, their challenges, and how to improve them. I don't just want you to be able to define ethical leadership, I want you to be able to analyze it, recognize the challenges of defining ethical behavior, and be able to apply it to a variety of communication concepts. Moral leadership is the need of the day, but it's long been needed and studied. Think about working hours. In the 1830s, people were fighting about how long children should be working in factories. 10 hours a day? No limit? Does limiting hours reduce children's ability to make money and take away their free choice? You can see that debate in Arkansas today. So, in some ways, that argument might seem pretty odd, but it was a moral and ethical issue for businesses at the time. I'm sure 200 years from now, people will be shocked at some of what we did and debated. And not just in big picture scandals or major issues like modern slavery. You'll need to make small ethical choices every day you go to work. Even reporting to work and not calling in sick to go to a baseball game or Vegas is an ethical decision based on your morality. Understanding the nature of ethical leadership will equip you to better engage in ethical leadership. Our book defines ethical leadership as the influence of a moral person who moves others to do the right thing in the right way for the right reasons, or a process by which a good person rightly influences others to accomplish a common good, to make the world better, fairer, and more humane. At a high level, ethics is concerned with the kind of values and morals an individual or society finds desirable or appropriate. Going back to our earlier chapters, we talked about leadership being a process where influence is involved. That influence dimension is important because leaders often have control, power, and influence over others. Their leadership affects other individuals and organizations. The leader's ethics establish the ethical climate for an organization. Northouse explains that character is a fundamental aspect of ethical leadership. But by character, he means qualities, disposition, and core values. This isn't who you are, this is how you chose to develop yourself personally and professionally. Northouse uses 6 dimensions or pillars of character: trustworthiness, respect, responsibility, fairness, caring, and citizenship. See Table 12.1 in the book for details on these. Actions refer to the way a leader goes about accomplishing goals. Let's say you need to speed up response times. You'll have a lot of different ways to accomplish that goal. Each way will have different ethical implications. Showing respect involves listening closely to followers, being empathic, and tolerating opposing views. Serving others, well, clearly serving others is an example of altruism, an approach that suggests that actions are ethical if their primary purpose is to promote the best interest of others. You may have heard of the servant leadership approach. It has strong altruistic components because it emphasizes how leaders should attend to followers' concerns and take time to nurture those followers. Servant leadership also involves contributing to the greater good of others. Showing justice. Ethical leaders make it a top priority to treat all of their followers in an equal manner. This places fairness at the center of their decision-making. No special treatment for people, but if people are treated differently, you will explain why and have justification. I would argue that for a leader, you need to be just, but make sure you're displaying that justice to the team so they can see it. Honesty might be one of the easier qualities to think of with communication. We generally dislike verbal and written lies, but this goes beyond that. Dishonesty can damage the person's character. It can damage organization performance. It can lower employee job satisfaction. It can drive out ethical workers. That's a big uh-oh moment for an organization. It can undermine your team's and group's reputation and disrupt communication and information flows. Let's say you ask your boss about a promotion, and the boss holds back or appears to lie when she says, "We'll see." What do? Go back and get productive at your desk? Probably not. You're probably updating your resume or asking a coworker what happened when they asked about a promotion. The boss may have avoided an honest answer for a variety of reasons, but by doing so, she damaged her own character and put a strain on your relationship. Imagine instead if your boss said, "I can't discuss promotions until I get the budget approved," or "Your client-facing communications need to improve." More honest answers might sting a little, but probably wouldn't leave you looking for another job. Let's say you end up in an organization where you're noticing unethical behavior. Maybe it's a lie about submitting a report. Maybe it's submitting a weekly report without actually reporting that week's activities, just a copy and paste job from last week. You have the power or the capacity to influence or affect others. Remember that earlier in the semester, leadership was defined as not needing to be a big boss. It happens at every level. A leader has power because he or she has the ability to affect others' beliefs, attitudes, and courses of action. Since power can be used in positive ways to benefit others or in destructive ways to hurt others, a leader needs to be aware of and sensitive to how he or she uses power. In the Chapter 1 lecture, we talked about the 5 bases of power and how they related to authority of position, assigned leadership, and authority of leadership, emergent leadership. You saw those bases pop up again, so let's think about them from an ethical perspective, since these can be abused. Here you can see a table about power and the pros and cons of using each type. If you look at the cost-benefit ratios, you can see that leaders might want to rely on referent or expert power because they are forms of soft power, where you're not forcing compliance, but influencing through characteristics of a person, that authority of leadership. Go ahead and pause and read through. Okay, let's talk about the values of the leader. Values are the ideas, beliefs, and modes of action that people find worthwhile or desirable. A challenge of ethical leadership is to be faithful to leadership values while being sensitive to followers' values. Ethical values are similar to the notion of character that's discussed earlier in this chapter. Modal values are concerned with the means or actions a leader takes. And end values describe the outcomes or goals a leader seeks to achieve. If an ethical value is about the character or virtue of a leader, then an example of an ethical value would be kindness. Since modal values talk about the means or actions a leader takes, then an example of a modal value would be responsibility that the leader takes, or accountability that the leader insists on. And then what's an example of an end value? Well, if it's the goals or outcomes that the leader wants to achieve, then we're talking about something like justice or creating a community. When we think about culture and leadership ethics, remember that different cultures have different rules of conduct. And as a result, leadership behaviors that one culture deems ethical might not be viewed the same way by another culture. Resik, Hengis, Dixon, and Mitchelson found that Nordic European cultures, such as Denmark and Sweden, place more importance on a leader's character and integrity. So they would be looking at and insisting on a leader behaving in a manner that's just, honest, sincere, and trustworthy. Whereas Middle Eastern cultures, such as Egypt, Turkey, or Qatar, have a different focus, and that's not as important. Now, let's look at components of ethical behavior. James Rest at the Center for the Study of Ethical Development studied ethical behavior in the context of 4 communication processes. When one of these processes doesn't work correctly, ethical failure results. By following these 4 components, we can be more ethical leaders. First step is moral sensitivity, recognition. This involves recognizing the existence of an ethical issue. In other words, we can't solve a moral problem unless we first recognize that one actually exists. When we are morally sensitive, we consider how our actions impact others, identify possible actions, and think about the related consequences with those choices. This sensitivity involves skills like empathy and perspective taking, because we are thinking about the other people who are involved and how those people might react. A classic teaching example is, let's say I collected paper scantrons of a final exam and left them in the break room. The cleaning crew sees them and puts them into the secure recycling bin, following policy. The semester is over. Do I call in the students to retake the exam? What about students who are already gone? With moral sensitivity, I'd care about the students and consider their perspective. That sounds great, but here's the challenge: moral tunnel vision. This is when our mental scripts don't include ethical considerations. For instance, if you're a teacher, you might be focused on other criteria and not consider the ethical implications of that decision. For example, grades are due. No grades, no teaching contract for next semester. So as a teacher, you're locked in that moral tunnel vision of concerns about yourself. Let's get away from the classroom. In the 1970s, Ford rushed the Pinto vehicle into production with a shortened time frame to compete with the European market. So the production was condensed to 25 months compared to the average of 43 months. And it's always important to note a condensed decision-making timeline. The engineers were also required to adhere to the limits of 2000. So no more than $2,000 in cost for this vehicle, and at the time that was a lot of money, and no more than 2,000 pounds in weight. Now, Ford knew of a problem with that Pinto vehicle from their crash tests. The gas tank would rupture after rear collisions and set the car on fire. Ford could have fixed the issue by moving the gas tank location, but they nixed that solution because of time and cost pressures. Even a small $11 modification was not made because of that 2000 limit. Auto standards were way lower then. The safety tests Ford did that discovered the problem were not required by law, so legally they didn't have to make changes. Additionally, Ford was reluctant to make changes because there was a widespread industry belief that all small cars were inherently unsafe solely due to their size and weight. There was another corporate belief that safety doesn't sell, because Ford had tried to make safety a marketing theme in the past and it hadn't worked. Here is where moral tunnel vision comes into play. The National Highway Traffic Safety Association, the NHTSA, allowed automakers to use a cost-to-benefit analysis to examine safety standards. This involved an assessment of human life. In 1970, each fatality cost, and I'm going to put that in quotes for you in your head, $200,000 by NHTSA standards. So, in an internal memo with the cost-benefit analysis, Ford determined that a recall and fix was not worth it. Essentially, they made a decision about how much a human life was worth and decided, we're going to lose some lives, but... Their mental scripts looked at this choice from a business lens, and they didn't consider the ethical and moral issues involved. Ford was indicted for criminal negligence and ceased production of the Pinto. They literally put a financial value on human life. This, of course, isn't just part of business history. Another good example is Kohler and the generators it made for boats, where people were getting carbon monoxide poisoning. Kohler's still in court about that. Kohler, Volkswagen, and Fiat Chrysler are all involved in lawsuits about default devices, which, to put it simply, change the emission test results. When an individual or individuals are reluctant to label unethical behavior as unethical for fear of being associated with the message and damaging their relationships, this is moral mum. This moral mum effect happens at all levels, not just with leaders. So looking at the Ford Pinto issue, perhaps there were people on that committee that didn't have moral tunnel vision. Obviously some did, but instead were experiencing the moral mum effect and were afraid of bringing up the ethical issue. Now, as you've already seen on the slide, there are ways to improve moral sensitivity, to fight moral tunnel vision and the moral mum effect. These ways include active listening, challenging your schemas, and fighting the moral mum effect by labeling things with ethical terms. For example, that was wrong of the team to submit the data when you knew it was incomplete. Supervisor moral talk contagion is a fancy term for something pretty simple. Do the right thing and show people that. So that's what supervisor moral talk contagion is. Increase the moral sensitivity and fight the moral mum effect for others by modeling moral talk to followers. If leaders consistently include ethics as an important topic of conversation, it can empower followers to speak up when they see an ethical violation. Being able to walk through how an ethical decision impacts others, has consequences, violates laws, etc., helps followers be more aware of ethical issues as well. Zanin and some fellow researchers found that subordinates are more likely to confront unethical business requests, like charging a lunch out as a business lunch, even if you didn't do any business, if their supervisor is known for discussing ethics and asking others about the ethics of situations. But, of course, you can't model moral behavior without making moral judgments. Moral judgment involves choosing the most appropriate behavior from the different courses of action in the moral sensitivity component. These decisions are made through ethical reasoning. So, you're thinking about principles like justice, fairness, respect for others. There are challenges here, including ethical blind spots and faulty reasoning. Research shows that people often overestimate how ethical they are, forgive our personal and moral actions, show bias towards our own in-group, and rely on prejudice and stereotypes in decision-making. Research shows we can increase our ethical competence by learning about ethical perspectives. The good news is there is a strong correlation between higher education and reasoned decision-making. That's why some local police departments like Frisco hire officers with college degrees despite state standards being lower. Understanding and being aware of our own biases helps. Listen to your emotions. Interestingly, research shows that, contrary to previous thinking, emotion actually enhances moral decision-making. Emotional and cognitive areas of our brains are working during ethical problem solving. So you want to consider our emotional reaction to our decisions in addition to looking at ethical reasoning. Does this feel right? The motivation for your decisions should come from moral values and concern for others, rather than other values, like shared values, or security, or being one of the cool kids, or being the big boss in charge. If that's your motivation, people will eventually notice. Moral motivation is difficult because there is a lot of pressure associated with those other values. This is especially true when an organization emphasizes those values and sacrifices the ethics in their actions. Think of a company that lies to investors, for example, or that overstates its potential in its new product, one that semi-bribes local officials to get a tax break. Or what about an accounting manager who wants to alert people to the illegal accounting practices at her company, but she's worried about job security and providing for her family? What if the company closes? What if she gets fired? So, she says nothing and hopes it gets better. That's the moral mum effect. Let's go another direction. Let's say your company lost a big client. It's budget cut time, and your boss lets go all of the part-time employees. You're mad because your best friend was part-time. You're stressed out because now your workload is increased. So the boss is out of the office on vacation for a week, and your moral motivation is tanked. So do you sit on YouTube, shop online, game on your phone, or do you keep up your normal workload? Does that hit close to home? It's hard. We aren't ethically perfect robots. On the flip side of that, positive feelings like being optimistic, that even with that new closed account, you can rehire those part-timers in the future, that can improve moral follow-through. So, you're at your desk, you're mad and stressed out, and you see a report that's due but not finished, and you're asking yourself, do I stay and do this report? Or do I submit a blank report and say, whoops, later? You're about to attach the blank report to an email, but how can you turn this around? At an organization level, especially as a leader or manager, you want to create an ethically rewarding environment. Praise people for moral behavior and then reward it. Make sure performance measures are not just result-based, but look at processes too. That's how the goals are reached. This ethically rewarding environment can also do things like model moral behavior, communicate the value of ethics and incorporate it into decision-making, rewarding ethical behavior, supporting whistleblowers. All of these things help. In the report example, that means remembering that when you make unethical decisions, it will promote unethical decision-making by other people. At a personal level, regulate your emotions. Note destructive, negative feelings towards the moral values and try to reframe your perspective. Is that hard? Absolutely. In this scenario, you might reframe this as not changing the workload. It might make people question your abilities if you're making mistakes. It might damage your reputation. So don't attach that blank document to an email and then claim a mistake and give yourself extra time. Be honest. And our final topic. Moral action involves implementing the moral decision. You can't just think, oh, that would be a good thing to do. You actually need to do it. Again, is this easy? Not always. Situational pressures are a huge challenge. This can involve opposition from others, fatigue, and distractions. There are several ways to increase the chance of taking moral action. 1. Think about your personal history. How have you handled obstacles like this in the past? How can you do things differently? 2. Believe you can make a difference. 3. Recognize your moral obligations, maybe to the organization, coworkers, followers, professional codes of ethics, etc. 4. Master the context so you can respond effectively when needed. This involves knowing what the company policies are, key decision makers, etc. 5. Build your communication competence so you can implement your chosen action. You must be competent to implement choices. Ethical communication should also take into consideration how very different business contexts can be. What are their norms, their speeds, their cultures? An ethical communicator will understand the defining factors of ethical leadership and apply them as they communicate truthful messages, complete messages. As this person engages in practices that encourages diverse viewpoints. An ethical communicator avoids provoking emotional responses to manipulate people. That communicator considers the audience and its ability to understand the message. Let's conclude with the International Association of Business Communicators Code of Ethics, which encourages being honest, being accurate, obeying all laws, protecting personal information, respecting free speech, honoring all cultures and beliefs, giving credit when due, and never profiting personally at the expense of the company, its employees, or partners.